Here are two flags. The one on the left is the one of the People's Republic of China, or PRC. And the one on the right is the one of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Red background, gold stars, these two countries share the same ideology, communism. So one might assume that the two countries are friends or even allies. Both countries are socialist countries with a one-party system where the Communist Party is in charge. Yet, thinking that the East Asian coastline is red and unified from Qingdao to Ho Chi Minh Town would be a mistake, as the relationship between the two countries has been sour since the end of the Vietnam War, eventually leading to the subject of our video, the border conflicts that pitted the two nations against each other between 1979 and 1991. But first, let's go back in time. In fact, China-Vietnam relationship being made of conflicts is nothing new. As far as the Han Dynasty, China considered its southern neighbor as a land for Chinese expansion, and Vietnamese identity came to be defined by resistance to foreign occupation. Chinese occupation since the Han and the revolt of the Trunk Sisters between 39 and 43 AD, and then Western, that is to say French, between 1857 and 1954, and American between 1955 and 1975 throughout the 20th century. The ethnic question is also a big point of tension between the two countries, as quite a lot of ethnic southern Chinese live in Vietnam, mainly the Hoa people. The Hmong tribes, who are another ethnicity neither Chinese nor Vietnamese, are also living on both sides of the border, which brings a lot of tensions. This relationship did not change with the arrival of the Western idea of communism in the two countries. Communism developed in Europe around figures like Marx and Engels and their book The Manifesto of a Communist Party, published in 1948. It was championed by the USSR and mainly spread through Eastern Europe. However, at first, communist elites of Eastern Asia were mainly influenced by the communist parties of Western Europe. Even though both were dead by 1979, the figures of Mao Zedong and Ho Chi Minh are of utmost importance to understand the difference between Chinese and Vietnamese communism. Mao Zedong was one of the few high-ranking communists not to study abroad, unlike Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping, who studied in France, because he did not have the financial resources and he was hindered by a limited aptitude in foreign language, amongst whom was French and English of course, but also Mandarin Chinese, which was not his mother tongue. However, he was nonetheless influenced by Western writers, including anarchists like Kropotkin or Bakunin. He took part in the creation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 within the French concession in Shanghai. His regionalist background and the harsh long march he endured would make him a strong advocate for uncompromising communism. When it comes to Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh discovered communism in France, where he joined the SFIO just before the Congrès de Tours in 1920, and he also joined the newborn French Communist Party just after. He turned out to be a communist more because of a strong anti-colonialist sentiment than because he was a follower of industrialist Stalinism. However, through his numerous voyages in Europe, America and Russia, he came to be a strong supporter of international communism and tied strong ties with the Soviet Union that would last up to 1991. It would also forge Vietnamese communism through a strong resistance spirit against any kind of invasion. Both communist parties were helped by the Soviet to attain power in their countries, but the Vietnamese party was also helped by the Chinese party during its independence war fought between 1945 and 1954. However, the fact that the Vietnamese always refused anything more than supplies coming from the Chinese led to early tensions, since they refused to work with Chinese military advisors. However, the final nail in the coffin that doomed the unified communist East Asia and that eventually led to the conflicts was the renewal of the ideology by local parties. Communism is based on a European society, hence the base of the proletariat in the Marxist theories, the industrial workers. However, China was not industrialized at all when the communists tried to rise to power, and with the civil war in 1925, the urban-based party members were, for the most part, decimated by Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. Hence, the doctrine evolved under Mao's leadership. His doctrine was more based on farmers than the Soviet doctrine. and the Vietnamese actually used the same doctrine until 1954, focusing on land reforms and the rural population. However, they never came to be considered as Maoists. But the most striking change came after the death of Stalin in 1953. Mao Zedong openly criticized Nikita Khrushchev, the Stalinization and the peaceful coexistence with the West that followed after 1956. This led to the beginning of a split between China and the Soviet Union, as China chose the way of extreme communism with the Great Leap Forward of 1958-60, and even more with the Cultural Revolution of 1966-76. Vietnam did not support China in its ideological conflict with the USSR and even began to criticize Maoism after 1959. Hence, during the Vietnam War, Chinese support was less important and determined than during the Independence War. As a result, Vietnam sought and received Soviet rather than Chinese support, showing the shift in alliances with a preference on an alliance with a Western power rather than with a local communist country that was ideologically breaking apart from the West. And the rapidly deteriorating relationship between the two countries turned to war when the Vietnamese attacked the Maoist Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in 1978 after massacres committed by the Kampuchean army led by the Khmers. The same year, Vietnam and the Soviet Union signed a 25 years mutual defense treaty that was openly aimed against China. Hence, after terminating the 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance on February 15, 1979, China, led by Deng Xiaoping, invaded Vietnam on the 17th. The bulk of the Chinese army was stationed at the Soviet border, but the forces engaged in Vietnam, around 200,000 troops at the time of the invasion on the 17th of February 1979, still outnumbered the Vietnamese forces, with around 70,000 regulars and around 100,000 local poorly equipped militia fighters. The Chinese rapid advance briefly threatened the capital city of Hanoi, but by December both sides had suffered heavy losses and peace talks broke down. Casualties are not known, due to poor records of both sides, but also to the fact that neither camp would recognize its losses against an ideological rival. The rough estimate would put the total tally around 20 to 30,000 killed and 35,000 wounded for each side. The war had a lot of direct and indirect consequences. First of all, a lot of ethnic minorities were moved across the border from Vietnam to China, mainly ethnic Chinese living in Vietnam called the Hoa people, who were expelled from Hanoi. The Hmong tribe suffered the same fate because they had been armed by the Chinese to lead a rebellion against the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese party entered a crisis and a purge was conducted. The north of Vietnam had been devastated once more, but it recovered quite quickly thanks to Soviet help. Between 1945 and 1979, Vietnam had only been at peace between 1975 and 78. On the Chinese side, the war had been a huge financial and prestige loss, as the Vietnam War had been to America, and it delayed the economic plan of 1979-1980. Some say that the economic loss was one of the factors that compelled China to accelerate its commercial opening to the West, which was on the way since at least 1979 and Deng Xiaoping's visit to Washington, D.C. Hence, the war quickened the normalization of the relationship between China and the West, which is what Mao had fought against his whole life. The leadership of Deng Xiaoping marked a shift in ideology and the birth of the China we know today. This eventually led Vietnam to do the same and become one of the fastest growing countries in the world, even though it is not considered to be a part of the Four Dragons, that is to say, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong and Singapore. Even with the peace reestablished in 1979, border conflicts continued to happen until Vietnam's exit from Cambodia in 1990 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Both countries normalized ties in November 1991. So, to sum it up, the Sino-Vietnamese War is one of the few conflicts between communist countries that escalated to open war. It is linked with different things. First of all, a different ideological adaptation of a Western ideology to an Asian context with a lot more rural population and a strong anti-colonialism shift, with a more hardline approach championed by the Chinese party and a more anti-colonialist approach championed by the Vietnamese party. But it is also linked with the renewal of old conflicts between China and Vietnam, mainly around questions of ethnicity. Finally, it is linked with different ties with the West, mainly with the USSR, but also with the US, as it had lasting consequences on the relationship between China and the world. Finally, tensions, which were brought down after 1991, are once again rising regarding the Chinese claims in the South China Sea.